Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome back for another episode. Today, we will be doing our second ever book talk episode, where I talk a little bit about a book I've enjoyed and I do my best to pull an idea out of it that I think is important, and then I talk about it both in the context of the book and then, by trying to apply it a little bit more broadly to the world at large. Today, we will be dealing with a book and a term called economism. In Economism, Bad Economics and the Rise of Inequality, James Kwak makes a compelling case that an overly simplistic understanding of economics, Econ 101, is exacerbating the economic, social, and political problems of both the United States and the world at large. And later in the episode, I'm going to argue that the core concepts that Kwak talks about here, they can be applied to a vast array of fields and lose virtually none of their value. So let's start with Econ 101. This economics class, typically taught to freshmen in college, or at least as the first collegiate econ class, it contains many simple concepts that have crept into everyday life. As an example, the very basic principles behind the theory of supply and demand, we've all heard of that, right? This might be the most pervasive of these ideas. Now, I just want to make sure I note that I'm not trying to just crap on this class itself, or the concepts that people learn in them. They form the foundation of better understanding later on, after all. The problem lies not in the class itself, but in the people who are trying to influence policy and politics, insisting that things like supply and demand, or other very basic principles taught in Econ 101, that they have any predictable bearing on complex, real-world interactions. What honest economists have come to realize is that these simplistic Econ 101 concepts simply do not express themselves in the real-world economy in any way that lines up with extremely simple examples which are used in the first pages of a textbook which was written as the introduction to an incredibly complicated field of study. And hello there, everybody. As most of you probably know, this podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together and, to get out there for you good folks to listen to. And you, our listeners, can help us by liking and subscribing on YouTube. So please take a second to click those little buttons. It helps a ton. And if you are feeling just a little bit more generous and you enjoy what we do here at Tribunus Plebis Media, you can help us earn just a little bit of money for the large amount of labor that we put into this thing by signing up on our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can make a one-time donation or sign up for a recurring monthly subscription. We do all of this for free, and we will never run ads in our works. But any contributions really do help keep the show going and improving. The page address is buymeacoffee.com/Tribunus Plebis. And of course, all links will be in the show notes and descriptions wherever you are listening or watching. Thank you. And now, back to the episode. Kwak notes that one of his primary goals in his book was to, quote, demonstrate that an unwavering adherence to simplistic models has had a pernicious impact on debates and policies that affect hundreds of millions of people. End quote. This is, obviously, quite the noble goal, and one being fought for in a country hell-bent on not only not understanding the basic point being made here, but wholly unwilling to even listen to the argument. In fact, to jump ahead quite a bit, the professor makes the case very late in the book that for the people pushing these entirely insufficient, simplistic, and fraudulently applied theories, and for all of those who sit rapturously listening at their feet, that these ideas, they can never actually be proven wrong, at least in the ideas of the people who want them to be true. Quote, Because economism's arguments are rooted in pure theory, they can never be disproven by mere facts. End quote. So because the arguments work in theory, then empirical facts simply cannot disprove them, because they work in theory. Here's something else that works in theory. All objects, regardless of mass, fall at the same rate. So a hammer and a feather both fall at the same rate, in theory, in a vacuum. A hammer and a feather both fall at the same rate if only gravity is affecting them. But if we go outside and drop a feather and a hammer, which one lands first? It's the hammer. The hammer lands first every single time. But why? It's because the real world is not a vacuum. The real world is complicated and definitely not a vacuum. The physics issue of falling bodies still says that objects fall at the same rate regardless of mass. This is really, it's a true statement. But it doesn't cover everything, right? The first thing most people think of when dropping a hammer and a feather is wind resistance. But even that can, feel confusing at some level. After all, a car should have more wind resistance than a feather, right? Because it's bigger, it has more surface area to act on, and so forth. But it doesn't. Because it's not that simple, and mass actually does matter. The real world is super complicated. And so is economics. In seeing how economics is a soft science which tries to understand human behavior, it's not even very predictable. People aren't rational, they aren't perfect, and, they aren't predictable enough for such accuracy to be within the realm of the possible. This is like repeatedly seeing a hammer hit the ground before the feather, but insisting that they will hit at the same time in the future because you know that all objects, regardless of their mass, free fall with the same acceleration. And you read that in a textbook, but you never read the next chapter about atmospheres and wind and friction and everything else. This is basically the idea of economism that Kwak speaks against throughout the book. The application of extremely broad, simplistic concepts onto incredibly complicated, real-world systems as irrefutable natural laws of economics. Economists on network news shows will say things like this. They'll say, a $15 minimum wage is a bad idea. And as a side note here, it should probably be like 20-something bucks, but whatever. A $15 minimum wage is a bad idea. Companies will fire workers, and the very people you are aiming to help will all be worse off. They will then add with a condescending smirk, it's Econ 101. So why is this thinking so pervasive? I mean, it's because it sounds good and people believe it. It turns out that people really do believe that common sense, aka things just seem right, should always be correct. For example, it doesn't make intuitive sense that hot water will turn to ice quicker than cold water in your freezer, right? But it can. When I heard this as a child, I really thought that the person was lying to me. I was absolutely sure of it. It seemed pretty clear that cold water will always freeze faster because it's closer to being frozen. But that seemingly simple idea is not always true. It turns out that thermodynamic systems are actually quite complicated and common sense does not always work. To further complicate things, economism is also often difficult to argue against without at least a small amount of specialized information. And not only that, but the time it takes to actually explain how dumb "this will be bad because Econ 101 says so" arguments are actually turns people off because, why did it take you 15 minutes to explain why something that makes sense is wrong? It sure as hell sounds right, you elitist liar. And this is just how humans are, unfortunately. And before we go on here with this next part about the minimum wage, I want to really emphasize about how, absolutely certain these economism talking heads are that minimum wages above the supposedly natural wage always harms workers. They create, pass, and block policies and laws using these totally silly ideas and affect the lives of millions of people in a negative way, all the while gaslighting them that they are being helped. Really think about how evil this is as we move on. Okay. Here is the primary argument against a minimum wage according to these economism dorks. Labor, as a commodity, exists within a market. Workers want to sell their labor, and employers want to buy that labor. So using two supply and demand curves, we can show exactly where the natural wage rate is, and that number represents exactly where the most people will be willing to sell their labor to an employer for a set amount of wage. The first curve on this graph slopes down from left to right, and it represents the willingness of workers to work for a set wage. The higher the wage, the more workers there are who will be willing to work for that wage. Conversely, the lower the wage, the fewer workers there will be who will do the job. Seems pretty obvious, right? The next line on the graph slopes down from right to left, the opposite direction of the worst, and they cross each other, forming an X. This line represents the amount of money employers are willing to actually pay for labor. The employer would rather pay low wages, or even zero wages if we're being honest here, but few if any workers would voluntarily accept this. So the employer pays as little as possible to entice as many workers as they can. Now, the point where these two lines intersect is referred to as the natural wage point, the point where the most workers will take a job at a rate that companies are willing to pay. And I'm sorry if that's a little confusing if you're listening on a podcast. It's not the easiest way to describe this graph. But if you're on YouTube, you've been looking at one of these graphs as we went through it. So don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. YouTube.com, I guess you'd have to search Tribunus Plebis Media. So do that. So they say that if we implement a minimum wage which is above this theoretical natural wage, then it upsets the ideal market balance and more people will be unemployed. Remember, this is the economism case against the minimum wage. I don't actually agree with this myself. I'm just telling you what this idea is, I guess. So the way this works, they say, is that if the minimum wage is above the natural wage, then there will definitely be more people willing to work. More people will want to work for more money, but the companies will want to hire fewer people. Those who remain employed will be better off, but society at large will be worse off overall because fewer people will be working. Some people would have been willing to work for less than the minimum wage, and now these jobs are left unfilled and these people are unemployed. This is what Econ 101 says will happen. Pop economists and political leaders from Friedman to Reagan to Paul Ryan and whatever current political goober and corporate dork you can think of have lambasted the minimum wage as a growth killer, a job killer, and said that in what might be the most oft-repeated economic and political lie over the past 40 or so years, that the minimum wage harms the very people it aims to help. But is this true? Well, real-world examples do not appear to show a rise in unemployment when minimum wages rise. Now, I will say here that a person can find studies out there that show a negative impact on employment when minimum wages rise, but honestly, one can find a study that says just about anything. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, like a minimum wage raise will always be absolutely perfect and good. It is possible to screw this up. You can't just say we're going to have $100 minimum wage for people making hamburgers. It just doesn't work, right? It's just way too much. But you can say we're going to have a $15 minimum wage or a $20. It works. Trust me. All that said, what I bet you can't do is find a well-done meta-study, that is a study of studies, that shows that same conclusion. The evidence is pretty overwhelming in favor of the minimum wage being a good thing, and so is the real world. Most famously, on April 1st, 1992, New Jersey's minimum wage rose from $4.25 an hour to $5.05 an hour, a significant increase. But the minimum wage in Pennsylvania did not rise. It stayed at $4.25 an hour. So two economists named David Card and Alan Kruger decided to do a study. The really beneficial aspect of this study is that these two states border each other, and the border area is pretty identical in the sense of demographics, urbanization, highways, and so on. It's also so close together that it's basically the same place, just with, that invisible line running through it. Which, I guess is honestly any border on the globe, but whatever. So this was a perfect natural experiment to witness, so the two men watched. Kruger in particular was convinced that the natural wage rate in the iron law of wages would kick in and New Jersey restaurants would have fewer workers. But it didn't happen, and Kruger was proved wrong. He proved himself wrong, really, when you think about it. More recently, we saw Seattle institute a $15 minimum wage, which all the same critics said would be an unmitigated disaster, and, yup, you guessed it, that it would harm those it was aiming to help. Unsurprisingly, it did exactly what it was intended to do. It helped low-wage workers and has even resulted in an actual restaurant boom in the Seattle area. Or at least it did until COVID, but the sector is working its way back into a normal time right now. What is obvious here is that the simple supply and demand curves most of us would probably recognize even if we never took Econ 101, they do not do an adequate job of explaining the real-world system of human beings, their feelings, their struggles, their lack of rationality, and ultimately their decisions. Nor does it explain the decisions that business owners make. It also completely and utterly fails to take into account power differentials and the very real motivating power of hungry bellies and the desperate need for shelter, health, and hope. Kwak goes through multiple examples of economism, tax policy, bank regulations, and so on, to further his point, but I think most of us can catch the gist here with just the minimum wage argument, so I'm not going to belabor that point. What I do want to point out is how applicable this concept is to any number of broad subjects, from sports to martial arts to math to politics and so on. In fact, there is a pretty high correlation here, I think, with what Kwak is talking about in the concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which states that people with low ability at a task overestimate their own ability, and that people with high ability at a task underestimate their own ability. And here we might replace ability with knowledge. People with a low amount of knowledge or expertise overestimate their own amount of knowledge and expertise, and those with high amounts of both tend to underestimate their own knowledge and expertise. The people who push economism are stuck on the Mount Stupid hump of the Dunning-Kruger graph, and they are trying to convince us to stay there with them so that they can take advantage of our ignorance. Well, I guess they aren't really stuck there. They know better. They are just there standing around and preaching to us and never letting their followers get over the hump themselves. The politicians want us all stuck on Mount Stupid, reciting economism talking points, defending them with insipid, "It's Econ 101, dummy" comments, and looking down on actual experts with an automatic and undeserving disdain. And my call to you, dear listeners, and I think Professor Kwak would probably agree here, is to not let them do it. Actually, I know he'd agree with it when I say don't let them do this to us. Be curious. Don't just accept simple platitudes as truth, especially when they concern something so complex as economics, which, at its heart, is about people. People can't be predicted and fenced in like this. We have wants and needs, and these wants and needs turn decisions that look irrational on the cold pages of a textbook entirely rational in the real world. Now, Economism is, I think, a very good book, and I believe that the overall point of it is important to understand. To me, this book was not about economists not understanding their subject, nor is it about the genuine disagreements economists of different backgrounds may have. Economists clearly do understand their subject, and disagreement and argument is actually good when well-meaning. However, and this is pretty big, not all economists are well-meaning, and even the well-meaning ones can be driven by incorrect motivations. If you see any economist writing for a newspaper or talking on television or YouTube or even a podcast, just know that they're there for a reason. They are there to push a specific narrative, a narrative chosen by the producers and hosts of those shows. See an economist on Fox News? Definitely pushing a neoliberal conservative agenda. See one on CNN? Definitely pushing a slightly more liberal agenda. Wall Street Journal and New York Times, same conservative agenda. And while I won't claim that these people are directly ordered to say certain things, they absolutely know what's expected of them, and they dutifully toe the line as they make their arguments. They know who's paying them and what they have to do to keep those checks coming. When they argue, they are arguing for their paychecks. They are arguing for whichever textbook or lecture hall theory most supports the views of their patrons, not for some sort of honest interrogation of the field which they study. Arguments like this should push theory closer to universal truth. Yet they don't. The problem that economism as a phenomenon, not the book, really seems to be firmly woven into is politics. And I should also note here that, the attempts by the same sorts of talking heads who knowingly tell these overly simple lies to us are, that they're meant to convince us that economics is actually separate from politics. And it simply is not separate. Economics is entirely encased in policy and political decisions. Everything is politics. Politically motivated talking head economists, those people paid to push ideas, fall into this group as well. Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, and 100 other assorted think tanks push partisan ideas into the public sphere. Economism, these simple claims that seem true on their face, which is, another insidious side to this whole thing, how simple and true it all sounds sometimes. This simplicity, to repeat myself a little bit, is used to give these ideas a false sense of consensus and a sense that the concept is, quote unquote, settled, that it's like written stone somewhere. After all, if it's in Econ 101, then it must be true across the board, right? It's the most basic economics, you fool. And we see applications of simplistic concept like this all over the place. Just the smallest amount of knowledge is enough for folks to believe that they truly do understand extremely complicated systems better than actual experts. For example, I drive an 18-wheeler for a living, and I can't tell you how many people who, tow a jet ski to a lake one time a year, that they've told me that they understand what my job entails. After all, they've backed up a trailer once, right? It's just backing a trailer 101. Or have you ever listened to, a blowhard at a bar try to BS their way through a description of something that you truly understand? Maybe your job? It's cubicle work 101, man. And they've described nothing that you do. Or maybe a hobby you love, shipping a bottle 101, or even a sport, football 101, or any other thing which you know a lot about and this person definitely does not. They can sound so confident, and it seems like common sense, right? And they can use that to fool an entire room of people into thinking that what they're saying is true. Or, I guess they could in the past a little more easily. I mean, I'm old enough to have been to bars and been unable to fact check the overconfident buffoon using the internet on my phone. But, I think you get what I'm saying. But at the same time, if anyone in that bar had just a little bit of somewhat specialized knowledge, everybody else would know that blowhard was indeed full of crap. Just kidding. Just like today, the overconfident blowhard would probably carry the day because what intelligent person would want to get involved with that? It would take time and effort just like it does today. And really, most of us just want to finish our beer and talk to our friends, not spend the night disproving dummies at a bar. This notion right here, the simplicity in the people not wanting to argue about stuff, it's one of the ways in which economists spouting economism take advantage of their audience. The audience is already primed to receive the info as is, right? You've seen the political playing field right now, right? People are just wild out there, and they are willing to take it in and then just to repeat it like a parrot, and they are extremely resistant to counter narratives as well. And now, as I guess I struggle to wind this whole thing up. I guess I'll just say this about the book. While I felt like economism flagged a little bit over the last third or so, perhaps much like this podcast episode, I definitely recommend this book to anyone who is interested in either economics as a whole or even simple politics. It's important to understand that Econ 101, while useful in small ways, is not the real world. In fact, it does not even describe the real world. Hell, it's not even intermediate economics. It's just an intro course with a lot of simple, sometimes useful, but very basic ideas in it. It's extremely important to understand that these simple ideas are being used to intentionally mislead us, to lie to us, to cheat us. Kwak does an admirable job of making this clear. And it is equally as important to be alert and to recognize when this is happening so that you can better understand exactly what it is that people are trying to do to you. And one criticism I have, beyond the book simply seeming to, lose a little steam and bog down towards the end, is that it was perhaps a bit ironically a little simplistic. I would have preferred a little more meat on the bone, as it were, but, not everything can be perfect. And this isn't inherently terrible either. The book is good, and it reads very well, and it reads easily, but it felt more like a surface skim, I guess, an intro. And yes, it feels a little strange to call economism an entry point that doesn't quite go deep enough, as this is literally what the book warns us about, in sort of a sense, I guess. But I would recommend to anyone who has read this book or will read this book to then move on to Economics Rules by Danny Roderick, as it is a bit more detailed and in-depth. Economism, the concept, does not describe the real world, but Economism, the book, certainly does. I highly recommend it. Pick up a copy, read it, tell me what you think. And that, my friends, is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Wherever you are, please like, comment, subscribe. Go to YouTube, search Tribunus Plebis Media. Give me 100 subscribers. That would be awesome. Then I could have a real URL that I could direct people to, which would make it a lot easier. If you have time, there are links in the description to do all of that stuff. Just follow the link tree. And yeah, I guess that's it for now. I'm sorry this one actually came out kind of late. We were on vacation, and this is actually my third time recording this. The first two came out terrible. I'm really hoping this one works out. So, thank you. I love you all.